Here we have a jump, an athletic feat that was covered on the news show a number of weeks ago. It's an Alaskan 2-foot jump. It's absolutely bloody amazing, right? It's an incredible vertical jump height combined with insane levels of spinal flexion to be able to bring your feet up above the level of your head and kick a ball here, right? There's everything going on. Amazing alignment, amazing foot to eye coordination, amazing athleticism to be able to raise his body mass up that high. Great mobility and flexibility to be able to basically fold yourself in half and bring your feet up above the level of your head. Nobody's doubting that as a jumping feat, but what I think a lot of people did doubt was how they would ever go about achieving a jump like that when they watched it on the news show. Jump training is not unknown. People have been studying jumping and plyometric training, jumping and landing, training of the stretch shortening cycle for 80 years, right? We have a very good understanding of what's going on. It's by no means something that's kind of left to the gurus. When we look into the details and get into the weeds of the scientific research and the old texts, you know fully what we need to do to get better at jumping. Now, looking at the thousands of athletes we've had for the last 10 years of coaching, the big things that pop up over and over again are incredibly common across those groups of athletes. There's very rarely a kind of lone star, or you're very rarely out of the group in terms of these 4 or 5 aspects of training where people's athleticism, where people's jump training tends to get left out. And the first one of these is that you're just too weak. So jumping, because there's a massive speed component and power component to it, people rarely think about the absolute strength numbers they need to have to be able to achieve these amazing feats of jumping or springing or rebounding. In fact, when we look at jumps and sprint values, the most important thing is the ability to produce force maximally. So if we have somebody and maybe they're incredibly light, maybe they're incredibly limber, they might have good reaction times, unless their muscle tendon units can produce force maximally, they are not going to have good jump values. Now, how do we go about developing this? Do we necessarily turn somebody into a powerlifter? Well, no, I think that's quite obvious, and it's quite obvious why we wouldn't do that. But we need to ensure that they're constantly chasing maximal strength numbers and pushing their absolute strength numbers up all the time to ensure they can jump as high as possible. This is the reason we've had some of the best tricking athletes in the world coming over and running the RTA squat program. This is the reason we get people with amazing jump values, amazing ability to do flips, back handsprings, all of these things, who really concentrate on their strength training for vast portions of their year to allow them, firstly, to be able to produce enough force and actually do the thing, and then secondly, to have those structures in place and to have those structures strong enough where they can absorb all of those landings after the big jumps. So does this mean we go and immediately run the biggest, longest strength block we possibly can if you want to get better at jumping? Well, no, right? I think everybody understands there's certain nuance here. You don't necessarily want to spend all of your year, if you're very interested in parkour or very interested in tricking, you clearly don't spend all of your year in a strength block. But what you do need to do is 2 or 3 times a year, take a month or maybe 6 or 8 weeks and spend some time on those maximal strength numbers. Don't spend all your time just manipulating your body around through space. Don't spend all of your time working with that lighter body weight. What you really want to do is just take those defined blocks or those defined seasons, really focus on the maximal strength numbers in those, and then when you get back into the hyper specific or maybe the exhibition periods of your year, then you don't have to concentrate on your squat or your deadlift or your power cleans quite so much. Now, the second area of people's jump training that tends to leave them down massively is that they do not train jumping as a skill. So every time we go and do seminars, workshops, training days, whatever it is, we do camps with athletes, we're often quite alarmed at the lack of jump skill or the lack of general skill people have with their jumping, bounding, rebounding. So this is as simple as getting people to line up on a line, ask them to jump as far as possible, or maybe do 3 jumps in a row. This is not a difficult task. This is something that you will have done at the start of most PE classes if you did PE when you were in school. Now, what's happening here? Well, generally, what we're talking about here is physical literacy or skill literacy, your ability of your brain to process these complex motor patterns that are going on, maybe develop those motor patterns through a prolonged period of training, and then having a better motor schema for what's going on. This is essentially the recipe your brain is going to use to make this chain of movement happen. The more times we repeat the recipe, the better that recipe is going to get, the more refined that recipe will become, and our brain will easily shoot that out faster and more effectively each time we do it. Now, when we look at jumping as a skill, a lot of the time when people are jumping, even if you're quite athletic and you've played maybe a field sport or maybe you've played a racket sport and you've been doing quite explosive movements quite frequently, you're rarely thinking about the actual movement of the jump. What you're probably thinking about is jumping up to get to that ball. Maybe you're jumping with the racket to get over and on top of that ball so you can get some downward angle on it. Maybe you're jumping out of the way to evade a tackle or something along those lines. In none of these cases are you really focusing or thinking about the mechanics of the jump itself, and then because of that, it is just a very, very natural movement. Now, there are certain groups of people on the internet that will tell you the natural movement pattern of your body is how you should move. Unfortunately, that's not true. It really isn't. We can teach people to move better. We can teach people to be more efficient and more effective with their movements, how they're moving their arms, how they're bracing or not bracing, how they're counterbalancing as they're dipping down for the jump. All of these things can be trained, tweaked, and refined slightly to make somebody into a far better jumper. And this is, if we look across another sport, if we look at sprinting, this is the equivalent of telling somebody that the 100-meter sprint finalist should just run exactly how they ran when they were a child, because that's the most natural and effective way their body could move. It's utter bollocks, for want of a better term. What you want is you want the absolute perfect model of movement for the jump or the sprint or whatever it is. Now, where do we see these technical breakdowns happening in normal people's jump? Well, the first thing is in the loading of their body. As you dip down to jump, what's happening to those structures? Well, usually with the feet, if we get non-ideal happenings, we'll get people's feet collapsing in, their arch might collapse in, then their knee kind of tracks in slightly. You'll see this a lot with basketball players as they dip down to go for their shot. They will have an element of valgus knee rotation. They'll get this inward collapse of the arch and this collapse of the ankle, which isn't ideal. Now, in this case, those basketballers are unbelievable jumpers. They're not using that small dip before they shoot as a massive power production exercise. But when we do look at athletes who are trying to produce power and trying to jump as high as possible, but might not necessarily be skilled enough to do it effectively right now, those small bleedings of force out through those joints are massively impactful. Now, the second area of technical breakdown we tend to see is very similar to what we'd see in the weight room. We'll see their midline and back positions just collapsing. You'll see them rounding forward, kind of collapsing down in their chest, losing midline stability. And in the same way there, where we have issues if we were deadlifting with a rounded back, we're going to have similar issues to jumping with a rounded back. Obviously, we don't have the increased risk of that shear force on the spine, but what we do have is the spine in a non-ideal position to transmit neurotransmitters as effectively as possible to the peripheral nervous system. The third area then, where a lot of people's jump training should be focused and might not necessarily have focused on previously, is when we look at the development of the muscle tendon unit rather than development of the muscle. So if you're commonly doing strength training or some hypertrophy training or bodybuilding, or you just like lifting weights, a lot of what you're doing there is really going to focus on growing the cross-sectional area of the muscle, making that muscle as big and as thick as possible. And that's great. If you want a big bench press, having big pecs and shoulders helps a massive amount with that. If we want a big squat, having big, thick quads and a massive ass is a great route to getting to a very, very big squat. Now, the problem is, if we're constantly doing these low, slow tempo, maybe no bounce in the bottom, maybe stop squats or pause squats every single time, we never get to utilize the stretch shortening cycle, which never gives any stimulus to that tendon unit for major growth or adaptation. So our tendon unit is there essentially as a very short-term escrow account. It takes energy from the muscle, stores it temporarily, and then enacts it onto the bone unit it's attached to. You can think about it as a very, very short-term battery or a very short-term storage for that energy that you're putting in from the muscle unit itself into the bone and essentially into the world around you, so you can move and jump and sprint faster and all of that. Now imagine the case where you're doing moderate to high reps most of the time because you want to gain some size and gain some muscle. That's the correct way to be going. You're doing very slow reps, so we're increasing time under tension. We're also making these reps more difficult, so we're increasing exercise intensity, and we might be making it more difficult by not using that bounce out of the bottom of the squat or the press. We might be doing it by not having a pause or not even locking our elbows out fully at the top. You might also be doing incredibly deep ranges of motion, so we're enacting on that force, or we're putting force through that barbell or dumbbell for longer. Now, in almost every one of these cases, this leads to us utilizing that tendon even less. So that tendon essentially only gets to store energy when we rapidly and aggressively apply force to it. It's an elastic band. If the elastic band is hanging on the end of this pen, it's never going to stretch too much if I'm just slowly moving that pen up and down. Now, it never stretching that much also never gives it any stimulus to growth. There's no reason for it to grow. It's not getting any immediate signaling that it needs to grow and adapt. And so then when we go to jump, we have this incredibly strong muscle belly or muscle unit. It's grown, it's thick, it's big and juicy. But then we have a tendon unit that's essentially useless and can store very, very little energy. And so all of that big muscle mass that we have accrued is essentially useless in our jumping application. Now, this brings us on to the next point. And the next point is the use of that tendon as a short-term storage system in the stretch shortening cycle. So, as I am jumping, or as I am trying to throw the hardest punch I possibly can, I'm using that stretch shortening cycle, that SSC. What this is I'm going to very quickly stretch that muscle. I'm going to very quickly, in the case of a squat, I'm going to drop into the bottom of a squat. I'm going to stretch my quad and my quadriceps tendon as quickly as I possibly can. I'll get some storage of energy into that quadriceps tendon. I'll then contract my quad at the bottom of it, and I get this kind of 1 + 1 = 3 effect from it. This stretch shortening cycle is absolutely vital in almost every sporting and athletic application. Now, if you want a real-time idea of just how much force we can charge into a tendon versus what the actual muscle itself is going to do, get a little ball of paper and put it on the desk in front of you now. With this little ball of paper, what I'd like you to do, put it on a flat surface, and all you're going to do is just using your finger and not holding onto your finger and kind of springing it off like that. Just use your finger, put it at the same level of flex you're going to have if you were to spring it off. So I'm going to hold it just like this, and I want you to, as quickly as possible, flick your finger. So not holding it back, just as quickly as possible, trigger your finger and flick it. Now, that ball of paper probably went a foot off the edge of the diary here and probably rolled another foot along the ground. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to load up these tendons that are sitting on the back of my hand all the way up my forearm here. I'm going to hold on to the diary in the same way. I'm going to load this tendon up now. And that went easily 12 or 13 feet across the studio here. This is what we're looking for. We're looking to load as much of that potential energy into the tendon as we possibly can to get the most out of our jumping. This is difficult. The development of these tendons isn't the same development you're going to get from just normal strength training or normal bodybuilding training. You will have to work on it. You'll have to start off with very basic levels of stage 1 and stage 2 plyometrics, but it pays off massively. The fourth thing then is a lot of the time people are too heavy for the kind of jumps they want to do. So a classic case here is when we get people wanting to be as explosive as possible, to be able to train in basketball very effectively, to be able to have a high jump, whether that's for attacking or whether that's for defensive work, to be able to jump as high as they possibly can. Now, the mass we move around with has a massive effect on how quickly we can jump and how effectively, how high we can jump into the air. Just a loss of 2 or 3 kilos makes an absolutely gigantic difference to how high we can jump off the ground. It's that simple. If you're really, really concerned about how high you can jump off the ground, the body mass you're moving around with is absolutely incredibly important. And this is irrespective of whether you're incredibly lean or maybe you're carrying a bit of body fat. The mass is the only important thing here. Obviously, having more muscle mass is going to be all really beneficial for that maximal strength, that development of that tendinous strength. That's going to be really, really useful. But to get the most height possible on these vertical jumps, or to get that amazing double-legged Alaskan jump we saw at the very start, you need to be as light as possible. Now, even if you look at someone like Blaine McConnell, Blaine's lost might be 4 or 5 kilos in the last couple of months as he's chasing these higher and higher jump goals, and it's undoubtedly going to make an absolutely massive difference to him. Now, he has the added advantage of being incredibly shredded before he started, and now he is just different level, non-human altogether in terms of how shredded he is. But if you're really concerned with your jump training and you want to make your jump higher, you need to be looking at the mass you're trying to move through space. The last thing then I would say for your jump training is start at very basic levels of jump training. A lot of the time we would get athletes coming in for their kind of end of pre-season peaks, or we'll have a look at their training for that. And when they start getting into jump training, so they've done a lot of maybe strength gaining or size gain in the off season, then they've gone into a lot of their aerobic and kind of maximal strength stroke power work in their pre-season. And then as they're kind of really peaking and tapering for those big competitions, they'll start working on speed and power a lot of the time. Now, when they start working on speed and power, immediately what we start seeing is these incredibly overcomplicated or overly intense or difficult jump training pieces. You don't need to be going drop jump into a broad jump into a vertical jump. You don't need to be doing something where you jump over 2 small hurdles, then jump over 1 small hurdle, then jump to a longer hurdle, and then do a vertical jump at the end. If you haven't been doing a massive amount of jump training, you will get a huge benefit and a huge payout from doing something as simple as getting a speed ladder, putting it out in the floor of your house or on the floor of the gym, and doing basic speed ladder drills on that, working on that foot dexterity. Just something as simple as that. That will help your vertical jump performance for maybe the first 4 weeks you're trying to get better at it. Now, when you start moving on from there and you start really working on that maximal power production in the vertical plane, what you want to be looking at then is something where you have measurable outcomes each time. Now, we've all seen it where, let's take a sport of CrossFit, for example, people are turning a box jump into the most efficient way of doing a box jump. Essentially, their upper body doesn't move, their legs just move up onto the box each time, and that is the most efficient way of a CrossFitter doing a box jump. They do really quick leg movement, then they squat their body up onto the box, then they hop down again, really quick leg movement, squat their body up onto the box. If you are concerned with doing the best vertical jump possible, you don't need to think about that height of the box at all. What you do need to think about is a certain point in your body. Ideally, that's your belly button or maybe the line between your 2 hips. And you want to think about getting that as high to the ceiling as humanly possible. Now, if you train in a place with maybe a graded striped wall behind you, that's great. You'll be able to do a vertical jump in front of that maybe once per week and see what point the waistband of your training pants gets to on that graded wall. Now, if you don't have that, it can be a bit more difficult, but what we all, or almost all of us, will have is a squat rack or a rig where we can do a jump next to that squat rack, video it as you're doing it, and just mark that center line on your shorts or maybe the heels of your feet each time, as long as you're keeping your legs straight. When we're doing our jump training, we're only concerned with how high you can push your body into space, not necessarily how quickly you can bring your knees up or bring your feet up onto a box. And that is absolutely vitally important. You just need to make sure you're doing simple jump training that's going to get a good effect for you, and then you're tracking to ensure that is being effective every single time. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you'd like to see more on jumping or more of any of the kind of strength and conditioning topics that are interesting to you, make sure you drop them in the comments down below. As always, this is brought to you by the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. You can try it during a 7-day free trial for free, obviously. Just make sure you cancel before the end of the 7 days. There is squat programs on there, bench press programs, deadlift programs, power clean programs, in season and out of season programs for athletes in different sports. If you have any questions for us, sikastrength@gmail.com is the best place to get us.